When she is not advocating for domestic violence survivors, she is taking care of her 6-year-old special needs child. Her story is one of bravery, resilience, and hope. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie to the stage. The other day, my mother came across one of my notebooks that included unread letters I had written. One was a letter addressed to whoever found it in the case of my death. The other letter was to my son, expressing that I did everything I could to stay alive, to be there for him. But if he was reading this, I had passed. My mother asked me if I still wanted these letters. I said yes, for evidence. Growing up, I never pictured myself doing any kind of public speaking, a common fear for many of us. In my 20s, I also never pictured myself here, alive, living and breathing, telling my story. A story fragmented in pieces of recollection that I hope can shed some light on domestic violence and maybe help encourage others to know that they are not alone. I met my ex-boyfriend, who I also refer to as my abuser, around the age of 23. At that time, I was a college student working on getting my degree in sociology. When I was not in school or working, you could always find me spending the majority of my time horseback riding. When I first met my ex, he came off to me as a somewhat shy, soft-spoken, kind, relatable person. When we first started dating, I learned bits and pieces of his past that he chose to share with me that gave off the impression that he had a very rough life and was doing everything he could to overcome that, and I wanted to help and encourage him to do so. One of the first times that I can recall that I learned that he was not trustworthy was a simple trip to rent a movie. I went into the store to get a movie and he met me inside. When we left the store, we were greeted by officers who were inquiring about who parked my vehicle in the no parking fire zone in front of the store. This is not something I would do, and I was surprised that my ex would take that risk of getting a ticket. He immediately told the officer that I was the one that did it. I felt completely shocked that the person who expressed great care for me would suddenly be lying to an officer for reasons unknown to me. He eventually ended up admitting that he was the one who parked there. At that point, I learned at the same time that the officer did that he had a suspended license. This had to be a mistake, I thought. He got arrested and I sat in my car with a stress-induced bloody nose as they drove him off to jail. After he bonded out, he gave me a sad story and I ended up staying with him. Unfortunately, this was only the very beginning of the manipulation and lies from him. Shortly after, he began to instill fear in me and our relationship took a major turning point. An argument led to something that I will never forget. I am leaned over, picturing in my mind what it's going to feel like to die in the manner in which I was positioned. A loaded gun inserted in my most private area for the person who I thought loved me. Terrified, I knew this was the end of my life. I cannot even express this horrifying feeling of impending death. However, the trigger was never pulled. He proceeded to keep the gun with him in hand and rape me, which felt like forever. When the rape was over, I bravely confronted him about what he had just done to me. I tried to leave, but he held me against my will, and so I waited until he fell asleep. I then was able to sneak out to my car and leave. He was attempting to contact me within minutes of my rushed departure. I didn't know what to do or where to go, because I needed to go somewhere where he couldn't find me while I processed everything that had just happened. I ended up at a friend's house, hours away, that he didn't know. During this time, I confided in 3 individuals about what happened. I also made it as clear as possible to my abuser that I no longer wanted to speak to him due to his actions. A few days later, I drove back to my parents' home where I lived. My abuser was in the driveway within moments of my arrival. I was completely shocked, as I had no idea how he knew when or if I would be there. I felt a vast amount of emotions. I was terrified of this individual, and I also felt ashamed and embarrassed that I was even in a situation like that. Not too long after, my family and I ended up living in a temporary house for roughly 9 months due to an accidental fire that happened at our home that destroyed almost everything that I had. I then found out I was pregnant. I had a very rough pregnancy dealing with my abusive ex who was back and forth between here and working out of state. One day during my pregnancy, he yanked me off of the couch and dragged me along the floor. At another point, I was in the hospital for preterm labor. When the nurse left, he violently jerked my head by grabbing my hair, holding my head down while threatening me, which is just one of many times he would do this. He was incarcerated for a probation violation when I had my son. When he got out, he was nice for a couple of weeks, and then he turned back into his true self. I was constantly in fear and constantly walking on eggshells whenever he was around. I really want to emphasize that I had told him countless times we were not in a relationship and to leave me alone. He never accepted that and would call me constantly. For example, at one point when I didn't answer the phone, he decided to call the police and report me as a missing person. The police came to my parents' house, checking in to see where I was. I, of course, was not missing. This was just another way that he would try to enforce control and fear over me, even when he was briefly out of state for a job. No matter how many times I tried to get away from him, he continued to refuse to accept it. He told me he would kill me and kill anyone I date in the future. He told me this on multiple occasions. Now you may be wondering why I didn't call the police. There were times I would threaten to call the police, but he would put his hands on my throat and tell me that I would be sorry once he got out of jail. He also would tell me he would do whatever it took to make sure I was arrested as well. I believed him. I had no reason not to. I felt completely trapped, ashamed, embarrassed, and defeated. I continued to think of solutions though. I paid his bus ticket out of state for him to stay with his mom a few times. I told him not to come back. He always did. He would show up unannounced and refuse to leave. He continued to mentally, emotionally, physically, and sexually abuse me. As time went on, I realized it was only a matter of when he would kill me, not if. Yet I still had to keep composure during this 4-year span, be a mother, be an employee, and finish up my bachelor's degree, all the while being in a state of extreme, constant hypervigilance and fear. My abuser also affected my family. We tried many different things to get him out. At one point, he banged on our windows an entire night, screaming and threatening. At another point, he laid on the floor of the garage for 3 days with his knife next to him, threatening to kill himself if we were to lock him out. We had to barricade the door to try to stay safe. He was so violent that I had to leave the house for my safety for a couple of weeks while he basically took control of my room in the house, refusing to leave. We tried to get him escorted off of the property, but was told he would need to get evicted. My mother did the eviction process twice, and the judge denied it both times, claiming he didn't live there. So it was made clear that no one in positions of authority seemed willing to help. During a time that I stayed with a friend to hide from my abuser, I decided it was time to take the risk and get the police involved. So I made a police report during a lunch break from work, and a day or so later was in contact with the investigator assigned to my case. During this time period, when I was in contact with the investigator, my abuser was living homeless by choice in order to stalk me. He lived in the woods outside my home and would make it known to me that he was tracking me. One day, when I pulled in the driveway, he was standing there waiting. I immediately backed out and called my mom to let her know he was outside and to call 911. Unfortunately, the responding officer only gave him a warning, and he was back texting me threats within minutes of his conversation with that officer. I continued to remain in contact with the investigator, and I documented everything. After hours of telling my story and collecting evidence, my abuser was finally caught and arrested. He was interviewed and admitted to just about everything, including rape, thinking his actions were acceptable. My case then went to a DA, and I expressed to her that I also wanted to pursue legal action against him for rape. However, I was told that rape cases normally never end up with a good outcome for the victim. My case was then passed down to the solicitor's office, where I spoke with a very supportive prosecutor. My abuser continued to get more charges while he was incarcerated because he would continually harass and threaten me from the jail. During the time he was incarcerated, I proceeded to get a temporary protective order, went back to court and got a 12-month protective order, and then went back to court again and got a permanent protective order. I ended up testifying at a jury trial that lasted a week, where he got convicted of all charges, which were 3 counts of stalking, 2 counts of criminal trespass, 5 counts of harassing communications, 11 counts of criminal attempt to commit a misdemeanor, and 1 count of violation of a protection order. The jury members even chose to stay for his sentencing. He got sentenced to 20 years with 10 to serve and 10 on probation. With the way that the system works, 10 years to serve actually meant 5. Over 2 years later, my abuser later pled guilty to felony aggravated stalking and is currently finishing his sentence in prison. During this time, I have been preparing myself for the possibilities to come once he is released, as he has made it clear to the judge that he plans on attempting to communicate with me and/or my son, despite his strict probation conditions and the protective order. I know that some of you may still be wondering why I didn't call the police sooner. My response is that fear is an extremely powerful emotion. It's easy to victim blame, but I truly feared for my life. I feared for my life with all of my mind, body, and soul. I not only feared for my own life, but I feared for the lives of my family members. I felt like I was doing what I needed to do to remain alive, and that meant enduring a lot of mental, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Since then, I have been inspired to be an activist and advocate for all victims of domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault. I believe in breaking the silence, standing up, and raising as much public awareness as possible. I also believe that there needs to be more laws in place to protect victims and that hold abusers accountable for their choices and actions. Thank you.